Welcome to the Bourbon Life Podcast, your source for all things bourbon. Join your hosts, Mark and Matt, as they drink and review bourbons, share news about upcoming events, interview the who's who in the bourbon world, and, most importantly, bring you along for the fun of living the bourbon life. Now, here's your hosts, Mark and Matt.
All right, everybody. Welcome back for another episode of the Bourbon Life Podcast. I'm your host, Mark. And with me, as always, is my good friend, Matt. Matt, how you doing tonight?
Mark, I'm doing great, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well, man. I'm hanging in there. Beautiful day here in Central Kentucky. Can't complain whatsoever. And we've got a great show lined up for everybody tonight. So I'm really excited about that. So I'm not going to waste a lot of time bantering back and forth with you. That's okay.
Hey, that's fine with me. We've got a much more interesting guest than I am. So,
well, real quick, I'm going to thank I'm going to give a shout out to our Barrel Society birthday members. We got Robert Javier, Matt Mayer, and Zach Sauber. They all have birthdays coming up this week, and then actually, I've got a birthday coming up this week as well.
I thought so. I thought the creative director and CEO had one coming up. Happy birthday to you, Mark.
Yeah. You know, it happens every year. It's funny how that happens, but hey, as long when you get to this age, man, once you hit that 50 and you move on past that, you're thankful for any of those extra birthdays that you're able to get. So I'm going to celebrate that and have a good time. So we're happy to be here and celebrating with you as well, Matt. So I do need to thank our sponsors, the Stave Restaurant out there in Millville, Kentucky on the Kraken Pike, making some great food. If you've not visited them, check them out, please. Just great stuff. Chef Kyle Klatka started out there in January, changed up the menu quite a bit, and the food that they're putting out is absolutely stellar. So check them out if you will. And then also 3 Chord Bourbon. We just want to say thank you to them as well for sponsoring the show. We really appreciate all their support. Ari Sussman, the master blender, master distiller with them, is just doing a really good job. So we really appreciate their support. So Matt, with that said, you want to tell everybody who we have with us tonight?
Absolutely. Let's waste no time and get right into it with the master distiller from Wild Turkey, Eddie Russell. Eddie, welcome to the Bourbon Life Podcast.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Matt and Mark. I'm glad to be here and talk to everybody.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you. You know, it's funny. You may not know this, but we've been kind of working on this. I was going back through emails, and it was actually, I think it was last February or March that I actually started sending emails about this. And, we had some tentative plans, and then we had COVID, and everything just really kind of fell apart after that. So we appreciate you. We appreciate you hanging in there and being willing to spend time with us tonight.
Yeah, it sure changed everything. Instead of traveling around talking to everybody, I've been doing things and all different kinds of podcasts. So it's still good to get to be able to talk to everybody. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, great. Well, we appreciate that. Well, Eddie, we say every week, we have a bad habit of forgetting what we're drinking, and we jump right into asking questions and talking with our guests. But so we'll try to avoid that problem tonight. So we're going to start out. I don't know if you want to tell everybody, we're going to do the Wild Turkey, the 101, the bourbon. So if you want to tell everybody a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so 101 is definitely what lets us do everything else at Wild Turkey. You know, the thing about it is my father, Jimmy, he didn't change a thing as everybody else were changing. His bourbon wasn't doing so good. You know, he kept his original recipe in yeast and stayed at the higher proof and older aged whiskey. So 101 is definitely our staple. I know I'm biased, but I don't think you can get a better deal out there in the market when you're drinking 6, 7, 8-year-old bourbon for $20, $22, $24 for a liter. You know, it's just amazing to see. I think Jimmy was always about doing old-fashioned way. So I think Wild Turkey sort of has that old-fashioned bourbon taste. It's got a little of that vanilla and caramel. With a big spice on the back end of it, because everybody put a lot of rye in their whiskey because rye was the first thing. But as my father, I came through, I started out there at Wild Turkey, be 40 years June the 5th.
Wow.
As an actual union employee, I was a general laborer, stacking cases, rolling barrels, dumping bottles, doing things like that. And I stayed doing that for about 4 or 5 years. And as I started working with my father, He always talked about the journey. He said bourbon, if you look at it, bourbon should have a beautiful color. It starts out looking like water, but
Right.
dark, deep amber color. The senses, you're using all of them. And then again, the nose. He always would take some other people's 80 proof whiskey, and when you smelled it, you smelled a lot of generic alcohol. But as we aged ours a little longer, you get those notes of vanilla and caramel and some of that char. So that just makes your body and your mind think this is going to taste good when it looks good and smells good. It's just like a good meal. Going to the stave and having a good meal, you smell all those good food, and it's going to be good. And the same way with bourbon. So he would always look at the whiskey through our old warehouse windows, and then he'd take a smell of it. And my dad done it two different ways. I don't get as big difference, but a lot of the older distillers were friends with my dad. They would say, smell with your mouth closed, and then step back and take a breath, and then smell with your mouth open.
Huh. Okay.
Your mouth open, you don't get as much as that alcohol. You get more of the true smells, is what he would always say. So double smelling, I was impatient. I just wanted to have a drink. The journey continues. I want something when it hits your tongue, it has a taste. For us, we want a little of that vanilla caramel sweetness where you age through that barrel. And in the mid palate, you want that spicy rye to sort of make your mouth water a little bit. And then the finish. He always talked about a good, clean finish. He loves a super long finish also. And I think that's exactly what you get from Wild Turkey 101. So if you haven't tried a little and got some, cheers.
Yep. Cheers. Appreciate that very much. Definitely. Matt, what are you picking up on the nose over there, man?
I definitely pick up the vanilla and the caramel. I get the corn's coming through as well. I get like the sweetness, like a caramel corn or a candy corn on the nose as well. That really comes through with it. And then there's a touch of that spice comes through from the rye on the nose as well. But it's just got a great, well-rounded, very, very staple of a bourbon type nose. The vanillas, the caramel, a little bit of the oak coming through, and some of that character with the like the caramel corn and that rye, a little bit of the grain and the spice with it too. It's got a great nose.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's what Jimmy always talked about when he talked about that journey. I mean, just think of all the adjectives you just used just from the smell of it, So that's what it was all about for us. And that gets back to us aging longer than most people did for many years. 8-year-old 101 was the only thing they had up until 74, 5, 6. And
Right.
came out with a 7-year-old 86.8 that soon became a 4-year-old 80 proof, which wasn't either one of our favorites because at 4 years, we think it's just sort of getting ready, that barrel aging. And then at that 6, 8, 10 years old, we think it's sort of in its peak, even though we did have a 12-year-old on the market for many years. It wasn't one of Jimmy's favorites because he, those Booker Noe and Elmer Lee and Jimmy and Parker Beam and all those guys thought, bourbon's not good once it gets past 10 or 12 years old. And I went and started tasting some older whiskeys, and I'm like, yeah, it can still be really good. But that's just sort of what they thought. A lot of them thought 4 years was the perfect age to put it in a bottle, where Jimmy thought, closer to that 8-year age. So just more time for it to move in and out of that barrel, picking up the vanillas and caramels.
Oh yeah, and especially here in Kentucky, you get those Kentucky summers and those Kentucky winters. Those barrels are expanding and contracting quite a bit.
Yeah, sometimes in the same week you get that. So you get a lot of movement in and out of the barrels.
Oh yeah. If you don't like Kentucky weather, just hang around for a couple minutes, right? Because it's bound to change. So now this is a blend of different ages, correct? So it's not one single year. So you've got a different mix there, right?
Yeah, and it's changed over the years. I mean, Jimmy always liked that 8-year age statement. There's times I put 9-year-old in there. Most of the time it's on a year basis, but sometimes every 8 months it might change. And it's just where we taste samples and we know, what everything's maturing and tasting. Right now, it's actually a little younger than it's been the last couple of years. It's more 7 and 6 with just a hint of 8. Where a couple years ago, it was actually a lot of 9-year-old in there. But I'm just looking for that taste profile, and that's
Right.
about for us. So the age matters in a sense, but I have a 10-year-old whiskey. Sometimes I'll put 13-year-old in just to make it have the taste that I'm looking for. So, we definitely taste and we definitely decide. For right now, it might be 7, 6, and a little 8. A few years ago, it was 7, 8, and a lot of 9. So it can change up on us, but I'm just trying to keep that consistency because that's what Jimmy always wanted.
Yeah, so that's the key element right there. I think with your I mean, this is really kind of this is your flagship product. So from year to year and from blend to blend, you don't want different tastes. You don't want somebody getting a bottle out in California that's going to taste completely different than somebody in New York and something like that. You're going for that specific profile.
Yeah, and Jimmy's, a lot of people talk about what do you do special overseas, and we do an 86.8 in Australia, but it's our 101 with a little more water. We do a 12-year-old in Japan and an age-stated 8-year-old, but it's the same stuff because Jimmy said he didn't only want it in California and New York and in between. He wondered if somebody was drinking it in Thailand, that it was the same every time they got it. So if they
Right.
States and tasted it, wouldn't be something different. So we've never really done anything like that. We try to keep it consistent no matter where we're selling it.
Yeah, that's good. So now the mash bill on this, that's can you tell us what that is?
Well, until Jimmy passes away, I'm not, but you can.
I've got a hint. I've got notes here that tells me what the mash bill is.
Yeah, I mean, if you Google it, a lot of times the correct one will come up. But
okay, all right.
So it's always been so funny with me because my dad has probably been the most open distiller I've ever seen as far as telling everybody exactly what he does and taking them through the distillery and not showing them everything, not just a little setup. And, but if you ask him his recipe, he won't tell you. I'm like, now my son, he'll tell it, but he's not so scared of Jimmy. I'm still sort of scared of him, so I don't tell it. But I'm sure what you got written down is right. And that's a very old-fashioned recipe.
Yeah, sure.
It doesn't have what you would consider a high rye content, but we use a really good rye and cook it a certain way. But, when I started, a lot of people that used enzymes didn't use as much malt as we do.
Okay.
You have to have at least 10% malt to have those enzymes to convert and everything. And so we've always used probably more malt than a lot of people do, So it's, if I look back in the old days, there was a lot of recipes for that same recipe. I'm talking about a lot of big brands you see out today. But as things were going, when I started in 81, bourbon was going the opposite way it's going right now.
Right.
A lot of the distillers decided to go to a younger, lower proof. They took a lot of the rye out because it's your most expensive grain. A lot started using enzymes, so they took a lot of malt out where we've always used the same recipe. We've never used GMO corn, same proprietary yeast for every batch. I've been itching to make some different recipes, but I think the whole company's like me. They're scared of Jimmy and afraid to try any. But everything we do is that recipe.
Okay. I mean, that's good to know though. So let's talk a little bit about you now. We talked about the 101 that we're drinking here. And this, here I'm a lifelong Kentuckian. I was born and raised over in Eastern Kentucky, went to UK. And, when I think of bourbon, this is probably one of the 2 or 3 bourbons that just instantly, I mean, this is like, to me, what I would consider to be quintessential Kentucky bourbon. I mean, this is Wild Turkey 101 is the true definition to me of what Kentucky bourbon really is.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at things, how they changed, and thank goodness right now it's changing the other way. But when my dad started in 1954, I think there was 57 distilleries left in Kentucky. When I started in 1981, there was only 8.
Wow.
So, Booker and Elmer and Jimmy and Parker Beam and some of the Medley boys from down there in Owensboro. And, Bill Samuels always had a distiller that worked for him.
Right.
One back in those days is Bardstown Bourbon Company now. But, so they were all good friends, and they all, got together and they all talked a lot. We sort of grew up together. But believe me, growing up, and you could ask Fred No the same question because I've known Fred my whole life also, but you don't really grow up thinking you want to work in the industry. Everybody's like, you got the best job in the world, and I'm not going to dispute that. But you don't grow up. You grow up in a little town like Lawrenceburg, which is a wonderful little city, but you grow up thinking, I'm going to college and moving to a big town.
Oh, yeah.
That's what you want to do. And same way with me. I actually went to Wild Turkey for a summer job on June 5th, 1981. And within 2 weeks, I knew that I'd be there 40 years later if I was still alive. I mean, I knew it was home for me. And I really appreciate, I didn't at the time, believe me, I thought Jimmy was the meanest old man in the world for making me work in the union like that. But it was probably the best thing he could have done for me was, starting out sweeping floors and rolling barrels and dumping bottles. And it just taught me from the very ground up, 40 years later, I still feel like I'm learning every day.
Yeah. So let's kind of go back and talk about that, because we always like to talk about our guests and how they got in the industry. Obviously, if I understand correctly, I think did your grandmother work at the distillery at one point? Is that right?
My mother did.
Your mother. Okay.
My mother actually worked at the distillery before Jimmy did. And Jimmy was a really good athlete, and he was sort of playing this semi-pro baseball league, and she wanted him to get a job. So,
behind every good man, right? Behind every good man.
She was the main secretary, and she told the bosses, she said, "Can you get him a job?" And he tells a different story, which is not any truth. He actually came into the lab and started working in the lab. And, like he says, back then you were shoveling grain, so you might be out shoveling up some extra corn. You might be doing anything, but his main job was in the lab. And Ernie Rippey was our plant manager at that time.
Okay.
He was a descendant from the Rippey family, even though it wasn't owned by them at that time. He was the plant manager. And they had an older distiller named Mr. Bill Hughes that had run the distillery as a young man right before Prohibition. And when Jimmy got there, he was a very old man. So they were looking for somebody to, sort of learn under him. And that's who he sort of took my dad under his wing. Now, my grandfather actually worked there. My great-grandfather worked at distilleries here in town. Really, it was Mr. Bill Hughes that taught Jimmy. And I think that's why Wild Turkey's always sort of had that, that's a very old-fashioned, old whiskey.
Sure.
Is because that's how he was taught. And Jimmy, from day one, when I would try to fix something that wasn't broke, he would let me know that, there's no use fixing something that's not broke. If it's working right, don't fool with it. And that's sort of been his mantra from day one.
That's funny. So now, when you were younger, then I guess you didn't plan on necessarily going to work in the distillery, but after your summer job that you had, I guess you said in 81, right? So then you said, "Hey, this is the place for me." So you pretty much started at the bottom of the ladder there, right?
Oh, I was the bottom man on the seniority list in the union. They hired me and another boy, and he won the coin toss. So I was the bottom man. So, at that time, you started out rolling barrels in the warehouse, and I loved that. But within a few days, they find out there's a new employee. You go to the bottling house, and back then the bottles came in the case upside down, sterilized. And that was the hardest job there, was dumping those bottles out on what they called unscrambler. That was the beginning of the bottling line. So back then, if we did a 3,500 case day, you were dumping that many cases. Assembly line. And believe me, when I got there, I had a few thoughts about, I don't think I like this job. But things were growing for us at that time. Japan had a really big bourbon boom in the early 90s, and we were
Right.
over there, and things were going. So they hired more people, and I got back to that warehouse, worked in there for about 5 years just as a general employee. Well, actually, after a couple of years, I took a relief job in the distillery. So there was 5 jobs, and most people knew one. I had to learn them all. And again, it was the best thing that could ever happen for me because I learned from receiving the grains in to making the yeast to making the mashes,
Right.
fermentation to running the still. And I did that for a few years. And one of our old supervisors, who'd been around probably longer than Jimmy at that time, but he retired, and they asked me if I'd come in the distillery, and I came in as a supervisor in the distillery. And that's when the training really started, as far as, Jimmy saying this or that, or this
Right.
causes that and stuff. So that's where it really started. And then, I laugh because there probably isn't a job besides accounting that I've done out there. But I left the distillery and took over the maturation end of it. So that means from the time they make it and I put it in a barrel and I age it and I pick the barrels out for the dumps. I started that about 93, 94, somewhere in there. And I did that for many, many years and loved that part of it. I love the warehousing end of it. I love all aspects, but the
Right.
aging process still fascinates me.
And then 2015, you were named the master distiller. Is that right?
Yes, sir. It's always so funny because, I think it was like 2007, they came to me. They wanted me to do a little marketing, really, was the main thing. And so they called me the associate distiller. And I mean, when you sign a bottle, it's hard to write associate distiller.
There's not enough room on this bottle to do this.
A lot of times I started just putting Eddie Russell in training. And then as Jimmy got to the point where he was traveling all the time, he amazed me at his age traveling like he did, and really loved it. He kept sort of pushing for me to be the master distiller because I was home doing the most of the work. And I kept saying, there should only be one master. And there was no way he was going to be master distiller emeritus. To Jimmy, he's still the master distiller today,
Right.
But in 2015, it was, something our company really wanted. Of course, I started traveling more, started getting more into the marketing end of it. So it's been a pretty neat deal.
Oh yeah, I can't even imagine. So I know we're getting kind of close to the end of the first session, but I wanted to ask, because we had Fred on the show last year and with Freddie, but obviously we talked with Fred about working with Booker and how that was. So can you talk just a little bit about what it was like? I mean, you worked with your dad now for 40 years. I mean, what's that been like to work with your dad?
It's not something I recommend to anybody. You come in and you have ideas, which doesn't mean anything to your dad or your family because they've already done it. They've already been there, and that's been sort of the blessing over the last 15 years or so, where I've got to release things that I wanted to. Even though he might not like it, but it's not easy. I mean, the day they hired us, he wouldn't even put in a good word for me, but everybody knew who I was, so they hired me. But that's just sort of the way, I guess, family is,
Right.
And you talk about Fred, it was so funny because Freddie called my dad Pops because when he first went out on the road, and even as a younger, Jimmy might be slipping Freddie a drink, but not me. And then I'd look over and Booker might be slipping me a drink, but not Freddie. So, it was sort of the opposite because I know Freddie loves my father and I love Booker. He was just, it was just this character you can't hardly even explain, where Jimmy was sort of in the middle. Elmer T. Lee was this really reserved gentleman, Booker was the total opposite end, and maybe Jimmy sort of in the middle. And it just amazed me listen to Booker and watch Booker. I mean, compared to what I'd been used to with Jimmy, you know, in that business. But I think working for your family is one of the hardest things you could ever do.
Yeah, I can hardly imagine. But it's funny because you know, when we had Fred on the show, we talked a little bit about the pigskin batch bookers they put out. So because I guess his dad was a pretty big guy, and was a pretty
Huge
big,
man.
yeah, big football player back in high school, and your dad was a semi-pro baseball player. That's kind of funny that they both had that sports background as well. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, they were both big men. You know, Booker was a huge man, you know, but, you know, it was a little more simpler times back then.
Right.
There wasn't malls. There wasn't all the social media. The TVs only had 3 channels. So most people spent their time outdoors, you know. So my dad played local softball and underhand fast pitch softball, you know,
Right.
till I was pretty good age, you know. But that's what you did back in those days. You didn't sit in the house and watch TV. So it's a
Yeah.
times.
Well, you know, if we did as kids, you know, we were the remote control. So, you know, we.
Exactly.
Well, let's talk about this the 101 real quick before we wrap up this first session. So, Matt, what are you getting in terms of the palate and the finish on this?
So I'm always amazed. We've talked to a couple master distillers from pretty large distilleries here in Kentucky that have staple products that know their palate and their profile so well. And Eddie, talking to you and hearing you say that, oh, this blend is a little more 7, a little more 6 with a little bit of 8, and before it's been a little more 7 and 8 and a little bit of 6. I'm always just so impressed with how you all know your maturation, your warehouse, your barrels so well to be able to make consistent product and know exactly what's going into it. And I think this is, like, to me, the palate on the 101 is like the definition of balance and consistency. It's got great vanilla and a little bit of sweetness from some caramel and some corn up front. And then the rye plays into it well, but it's certainly not overpowering, but it's got a good little bit of spice to it. Nice long finish with vanilla. And then the rye comes back with a little bit of spiciness at the end. All throughout, there's just this warm toastiness from the oak. It's just a true testament to how great of a job you all are doing, and you especially, in being able to put out this product consistently, knowing where you need to grab barrels from, how you need to be blending your batches and doing it to bring this to market. And at the price that you're doing it is really just amazing. This product stands on its own, regardless of the price, and the price point of it is just the icing on the cake.
I appreciate that. I mean, you know, I learned from Jimmy, and there's probably not too many that sort of do it anymore, but Jimmy tasted the White Dog. That was one of the first things he did right off the still, the new distiller. Every morning, that was one of the first things he did, was went in the lab and tasted and smelled the White Dog. And then later on in the day, he was tasting what we call anniversary samples. So we tasted 2 years, at 4 years, at 6 years. And really for us, it's right around that 6 years age before we can say, hey, let's hold a little of this back for our Russells or a rare breed or our 12-year-old overseas, or for something really special. Or let's put this in the 101 or 81 or whatever. But it's, you know, you think of it as a lot of work of tasting that whiskey and keeping your notes and figuring out how those 7 different floors of the warehouse are going to affect your whiskey.
Right.
Time, you know, like I said, sometimes at 6 years it's fully mature. Sometimes it takes 8 or 9 years for it to fully mature like we want it to. So that's the best thing about Kentucky, is we're in no hurry. You know?
Yeah, that's right.
As fast as bourbon has grown, it's been a little hurry to make more for down the road, but that's what people can't hardly understand about our industry. It's just like when the rye whiskeys took off. Why don't you have any? Well, for 30 years, nobody was drinking it, so we didn't make much. It's going to take 5 or 6 years. You know, for us, it's going to take 6 to 10 years to get it ready. So just luckily for us, Jimmy's been around so long that he's seen all the ups and downs. And even when the company was saying, let's don't make as much, he would say, yeah, let's make a little extra. And when they were saying, oh, we're growing by 12 or 15% the last few years, Jimmy's like, yeah, but I've already made that. We don't want to make that big jump because it's going to be 10 years before we sell it. And that's hard for even our company to understand because it's just such a different industry.
Yeah, definitely. And man, I agree with you, man. Everything you said, taste profile, Wild Turkey 101, it's one of those bourbons we drank back in college. And it's still one of those bourbons that everybody needs to have on their bar. There's no question about it. It's a solid drinker. It's a little bit higher proof than what I think an introductory bourbon would be, but I still think this is a great introductory bourbon. I mean, this is one I wouldn't hesitate to say, hey, if you're a new drinker, try the 101, maybe with a little bit of ice just to cool it down a little bit for you. but yeah, it's definitely solid. So I'll tell you what, let's close out this first session. For me, obviously 101, 2 thumbs up for me. Matt, what do you think, man?
Absolutely.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, so let's close it out and get a word from our sponsor, and we'll be back in just a minute with more with Eddie Russell from Wild Turkey.
Hey, Bourbon Lifers. When you're out hunting for those hard-to-find bottles or just enjoying the distilleries of Central Kentucky, you're going to work up an appetite. And when it's time to refuel, we suggest that you visit our good friends Rebecca and Eric Burnworth at the Stave Restaurant. Located at 5711 McCracken Pike in Millville, Kentucky, close to Castle and Key and Woodford Reserve, the Stave Restaurant is just off the beaten path, nestled on the banks of Glens Creek. With a newly redesigned menu, Chef Kyle Klatka prepares amazing food each day featuring an elevated Kentucky-inspired cuisine. You can take our word for it. The food alone is worth the trip to the Stave. With a full-service bar, great bourbon flights, and signature cocktails, the Stave is the perfect place to catch up with friends after a fun-filled day of touring the local distilleries. And you can even purchase bottles of bourbon to take home with you while you're there. Make sure to follow the Stave on Instagram and Facebook at The Stave Kentucky, or visit them online at thestavekentucky.com to stay up to date on everything that's going on. The Stave Restaurant is a bourbon lover's paradise, right here in the heart of bourbon country.
All right, everybody, welcome back for round 2 of the Bourbon Life Podcast. I'm your host, Mark, and with me, as always, in the Bourbon Life studios is my good friend wearing a toboggan today in mid-May, my good buddy, Matt.
Yeah,
Matt, what's up?
If I didn't have to be wearing it, but it's cold outside. It was 40 degrees this morning here. So
yeah, but it's even, of course, my basement's pretty cold where we are.
That's
keep
right.
It's like the pits of despair down here, right? So it's like 20 degrees colder than outside or the first floor or anywhere else. So
yeah, like the fortress of solitude down here.
Hey, but fortunately we got some good stuff to drink tonight.
That's right. We've got plenty of stuff to keep us warm here by the fire. And we've also got a great guest joining us tonight. So back again for round number 2 or session or period or whatever you call it. Number 2 is the master distiller from Wild Turkey, Eddie Russell. Eddie, welcome back for the second round. And we have got poured up your Wild Turkey 101 rye. Why don't you go ahead and walk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, so our 101 rye, I mean, it's amazed me. There's been so much change in our industry. We brought in a whole younger generation of men and women that are starting out drinking bourbon, usually in a cocktail and on-premise facade faces that we never had before. But I think rye has been the most shocking thing for me because, that's the first thing that was made in America. George Washington was making rye whiskey, and Pennsylvania and Maryland were the 2 states that when my father started, it didn't come from those states. And they actually sourced some from both places back when he first started for their rye whiskey. And it's sort of like bourbon. For a long time, people thought it had to come from Kentucky. Back when he started, people that drank rye thought it had to come from Maryland or Pennsylvania. And but those places closed down in the 70s, early 70s, and they had to start making their own. And not many people were making it, us and Beam. And, I think Heaven Hill would put out a little bit every now and then, but consistently we were making rye whiskey. And again, the same thing, Jimmy's recipe, same proprietary yeast. It's just a different taste profile. My dad doesn't drink any rye at all. He knows how to make it. He knows what it should taste like. but he's not drinking any of it. My son who works for us now, he thinks it's the best thing we make.
Wow.
Me, I'm sort of in between. I like the rye, but I'm more of a bourbon guy. I like my rye and my cocktails a little more. But
Right.
rye, we have a couple other ryes we've got out there, but the 101 rye to me is, again, just like the 101 bourbon, a very old-fashioned rye whiskey. There were sort of two styles, and there still is today. There was a style where it was a 95 or 100% rye with enzymes. And then there's a style like us. We actually use a little less rye and add some corn to it. It's just the difference in who's making it. Those bourbon guys are going to get a little corn in all the recipes, I guess.
Right.
But still, when you're looking at rye, you're looking at you might get a little of that vanilla and caramel, but you should get a little more of that spicy, sort of peppery type smell and taste as you drink it. 101 for a bartender should be on every bartender's to make a cocktail with, because it's such a great rye to make a drink with. But still a sipping rye whiskey, and it tends to be the younger generation that's drinking the rye whiskeys. And you've got that good color, but you're looking at only 4 or 5 year old. Now I've released a little older ryes down the road in the past, and I love the little older rye, but most of them are in that 4 to 5 year old range, and that's what you'll see on 101. Most of the time it's 5.5 years old. But you're looking for more of that spiciness right off the bat. So you're looking for what I always think of, a little bit of that sort of black pepper taste to it. You're still getting a little bit of that wood, a little smokiness from that rye. That's sort of what I get out of it. Again, the same thing on the finish, a longer finish for us, but that rye sort of keeps coming back and coming back.
Yeah, definitely. So now, in terms of I know we talked earlier about the 101 bourbon, and we mentioned the mash bill. We did not clarify that, so I'm assuming the same theory applies on this one.
Yes, sir. I can't tell it, but call my son, look on Google, and he'll tell it. But
yeah, so
it's like I said, it's the style where you're not doing that 95% or 100%, and we use the same amount of malt because we're looking for that natural conversion with those enzymes converted into that fermentable sugars. Still using that, but we use corn in it, and a lot of the old bourbon guys do. Still a lot of them, a lot of them that came out of Indiana, a lot of those were the 95% rye, 5% malt. It's just a different style, just a little more drinkable this way than that, because ryes can be really bitey right at the beginning. So if I guess they always thought that corn sort of mellowed that down a little bit. But as you taste this, it's completely different. Your bourbon, you're getting that rye taste, like rye bread, or right off the bat. As soon as you're getting a taste, you're getting that instead of that sweetness first, and then some of that spiciness.
Yeah, definitely, Matt. You're over there working it over. I know Matt's a rye guy. Talking about these younger kids coming up. Matt's one of those younger guys. He's more of a rye fan. So Matt,
I think rye as a grain is really versatile. It's not to say that corn certainly isn't. You can bake with corn, you can cook with corn, but I think rye lends itself to a lot of different flavor profiles, and that's one of the reasons I like it. And this, to me, the nose is really crisp. I pick up like a really tart green apple. Is really, really characteristic on the nose for this. And then it leads to like a little bit of like caramel or butterscotch, and then the peppery, the black pepper comes through, and almost like a little cardamom as well on the nose.
Yeah, if you can't tell, Matt's worked in the baking industry and as a cook as well. So Matt knows his way around the kitchen and the baking spices. So he always pulls out some good profiles on things.
I get a tickled at it because when I first started describing things I tasted to my father, he just looked at me and said, "I'm putting none of that in my whiskey." His only descriptors on everything: vanilla, caramel, spicy, and astringent. Astringent meant alcohol taste to him.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That was it. So, like when I first, I know you said you had Fred Noe on when he took over Booker's. He said that was the scariest time, for him, making sure that he would make his dad proud. Well, when I took over Pill and Barrels for Rare Breed, which we'll taste here next, same way. And I'm in there and I'm telling my dad, I'm like, Rare Breed's a little different. I get a big bite right up front. And I said, then I get that creamy vanilla caramel with just hints of dark chocolate. Put no chocolate in my whiskey, so I understand exactly when people are throwing out adjectives like that. Jimmy just looks at him like, I didn't put none of that in my whiskey.
Well, and Eddie, that's kind of going back to me. That's why Matt and I make a good co-hosting team, because Matt has a good nose and a great palate, and he can pick those things out. But for me, I'm kind of that. Yeah, it's sweet. I get caramel, I get vanilla, I get spice of some form, and that's the limit of my palate.
I think it's a little different now, but I think your palate is what most people's palates are.
Yeah.
There's people that like Matt, or definitely the distillers and the tasters of the world. They're going to taste different things, but the majority of people, they want something that's good and consistent. And like you said, I get a little sweetness that you might describe it as vanilla caramel. Somebody might say butterscotch, and then
Right.
spice that you're not going into, any more than that. And I think that's perfect.
Yep. Well, I appreciate that. So we talked about you a little bit in the first session. Let's talk a little bit about Wild Turkey itself, the actual distillery, the history of the brand. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that itself?
Well, actually, where our distillery was started by the Rippey family in 1869, right down on the Kentucky River. And then in 1891, they moved up to the same spot we are today. Because they figured out when you're right down on the river, you get flooded a lot.
Yeah.
So they actually came up on top of the hill. We're about 240 feet, sitting right over top of the Kentucky River. And, things were going along. They sort of sowed it. Those days were a little different than what most people really think, because there was a couple companies that bought and sold. And, ours was one of those where, you only had X amount of what you made you could actually sell on your own. The rest of it was going to these big corporate dudes, even at that time. And then I think the Rippies actually bought everything back in 1904. And then, of course, Prohibition came along.
Right.
Mr. Bill Hughes, they told my dad, started as a young man right before Prohibition, was in the distillery, running the distillery. And then afterwards, it started back up. They got things going. Of course, those families, they hadn't made legal money since Prohibition had been going on. So a lot of them needed sort of people to help them out. I love the commercial where everybody got together and rebuilt the Jim Beam distillery.
Right.
It's not exactly right, but it's really the truth. You had to have some help to get back going, because some of the distilleries were torn down. And so the Austin Nichols Company was one of them that they had sort of helped getting us going. And we were making a little whiskey for them. They were out of Brooklyn, New York at that time. And, the story goes, and Jimmy swears by it, so I'll say it's 100% true. Also, they used to come down to the Carolinas and go turkey hunting every year, wild turkey hunting. And Mr. Bill Hughes had this recipe that we're still using today. It was different from what they'd been selling. He gave them a few bottles of it to take on the turkey hunt. And, that was 36, I think. And they kept saying, we want some more of that turkey whiskey. Austin Nichols was a huge company at that time. They owned a lot of grocery store chains, S&H Green Stands. They had a liquor division, and they sold a lot of that off and decided to go just alcohol. But in 1940, they actually released, my dad told me, he said when Mr. Bill Hughes told him that when he went back and checked the barrel that he got the samples out of it, it was 8 years old and 101 proof right out of the barrel. So
Gotcha.
decided to go with that. And 100% believe that, because you couldn't even put it in a barrel higher than 110 proof up until the 60s. So everybody distilled at a lot lower proofs back in those days.
Gotcha.
We barreled at 107 for many, many years. So they distilled and barreled at a lot less proof. So they went with 8-year-old 101, and we were making it. But then there was a couple of guys named the Ghouls out of Cincinnati. They came in and bought the distillery, and their main brand was JTS Brown. When I was a kid, everything out there, the trucks were painted JTS Brown, the uniforms the employees wore was JTS Brown. And then about 1970, Liggett Myers, or Liggett Group at that time, they bought Austin Nichols and then turned around and bought us, and decided to only make wild turkey. So the brand JTS Brown, I think Heaven Hill owns the brand now, maybe, or somebody. And, so it started being just wild turkey, and it just grew from there. Of course, we were bought by a French company in 1981. And then, of course, 2009, Campari bought us. We have, from about we started looking at it probably 2003 or 4, because we had the same original distillery, just been pieced together. And we've actually built a brand new distillery, $50 million distillery.
Wow.
Just 2010. So we actually got a head start on what's going on today.
Mm-hmm.
Not really realizing what was going to happen, but we were just at the point where we were basically at max capacity at our old distillery. So we basically moved it across the road and built a new distillery. And since then, we've built new bottling facilities. We build in warehouses every year. So about $120 million has been pumped in our facility in the last 10 years. So it's just amazing, here in Lawrenceburg, us and Four Roses both. The city's 10,000 people. So it's a really good deal for our community, not only the employees, but, the taxes you pay and everything that you do. So it's amazing. I've just been so lucky to see it from where everybody was dying out in 1981 to what today, and all the in-betweens. For my first 25 years, the only people that drank bourbon was me. 50 and older males, and mainly Southern males.
Yeah.
Oh, and nowadays our biggest growing consumer is a 21 to 40-year-old male or female. So it's just amazing to see what's all happened in our industry, and just super lucky that I've been able to see it happen.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about that, obviously, because you started in 81, and that was really the time where, bourbon was just, I guess the younger generation at that point in time had seen it as their grandpa's drink or whatever the older generations drink, and they were going to go completely opposite of that, and vodka, the clear liquors, everything else. And then, you got, your dad, Elmer, those guys, they put in a ton of work to really promote bourbon as a drinkable spirit. And it seemed like it really started happening. So can you talk a little bit about that transition, how those things happen?
Yeah, I think there were several reasons. It was a Southern gentleman's drink. You didn't sell a lot up in the Northeast or Northwest, because during Prohibition, they'd got a lot of Canadian whiskey.
Yeah.
Drinking a lot of lower proof stuff. So we really focused on the Southern states at that time, and older gentlemen. Everything was sort of focused on those people. Vodkas came out. That changed a lot. But I think my generation also was part of it. My generation was, I'm not doing anything my dad did or my granddad did. If they drive a Ford, I'm driving the Chevy. It was just
right.
Free love, hippie, and it changed everything. And then all of a sudden in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, you got this generation that was looking back what drinks were being made back in the 1800s and who made them and the history. And I think that's been super important to Wild Turkey because the whole history's there and seeable. So it's been really good for us. So it's just been such a crazy journey because still, when I was around people working for my dad, they were older gentlemen, and I always liked the ice cube in my drink. Now I drink most of it neat, but at that time I was like you said, I wanted the ice cube in there to sort of mellow everything down, and they berated me for that. Bourbon drinkers drink it neat, for a little water, and I've never liked adding water to my bourbon. I think the ice is a little water, but that chill part of it, I never just like to pour water in there, but some distillers did.
Sure.
Seeing that change, and then those bartenders, they became our ambassadors without pay because they started making Manhattans and Old Fashions and Boulevardiers, and they were proud of them and they talked about them. And then a young generation started going, I used to laugh all the time because bartenders would tell me stories about, I made a drink for this guy or this lady and they loved it. And then I told them it had bourbon in it, and they said, "Oh, I don't like it. I don't like bourbon." They were sitting there going, "But you really do. You just love that." So they did a lot of free marketing for our whole industry, by going back, instead of making the vodka with 14 ingredients, they were making the bourbon drinks with 3 ingredients, and people were loving them. And
Yeah.
back at that history. So that changed so much because, like I said, our biggest growing consumer is that younger man and woman, which is not what it was my first 20 years.
Sure. So, I mean, obviously things have changed over the last, you've been in the industry 40 years now. So, I mean, things have obviously changed, and that's really cool. But you've been an innovator yourself there at Wild Turkey. And I know working for your dad, you kind of referenced that a little bit earlier, that it's hard to make changes when you have to answer to Jimmy. But you've done some things. You've really innovated some things there. Can you talk a little bit about
Do we want to pick that up on the next session here? That might be a great way to. I'm just thinking that we can really run with this one here, Mark. So I don't want to cut anybody off, but maybe we should start round 3 that way.
All right, we can save that for round 3 if that's okay. Then Eddie,
that sounds good.
We'll remember that question. So let's go back and talk a little bit more about the rye, because I don't want to say we've avoided talking about it, Matt, but it's good. I mean, I really enjoy the rye. So what do you think?
Yeah, I'm loving it. It's got that big, bold, peppery palate on it right up front. And then so the first sip was real hot, and then when I went back for the second one, was able to pick up more of the flavors on it. That peppercorn comes through, the baked bread, the rye from the baked bread, and like a caraway, a nice like crisp caraway, and then I still got some of the green apple, and then it lended its way to like a nice sweetness at the end with a good peppery finish. Just a really great, nice, spicy, bold rye.
Yeah, I agree, man. I get almost kind of like a brown sugary type of flavor with this, and then it kind of goes away, and that like you said, the black peppercorn, that spiciness, it really lingers on the palate, on my tongue, which I really enjoy. So yeah, definitely an excellent rye. I mean, for this one runs around the same price range. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think it runs right along 101. And like I said, this has been the craziest thing for me because I think in 2007, there was 89,000 cases of rye, American rye, sold in the world. In the last few years, there's been over 1 million cases.
Wow.
It's just shot through the roof. And like, again, I'm not seeing as very many older people switching to rye, but the younger generation and the bartenders, again, they helped that out because when they went back and looked at the old drinks, it was made with rye whiskey because that's what was around. So they started making the drinks with the rye. I mean, for me, I was making rye 2 days a year. I'd make it one day in the spring and one day in the fall. And a lot of times didn't sell all that, even though we were us and Jim Beam and Old Overholt were the only three you found in a liquor store on the bottom shelf for many, many years. And now I'm making rye 3 or 4 days a month.
Wow.
It's grown a lot.
It's these young whippersnappers like Matt.
Well, hey, if you've got any of that older rye you're still looking to get rid of, let me know.
We can work some out.
Well, I tell you what, we'll take a quick break. We'll get a word from our other sponsor, and then we'll come back and we'll pick back up on that question that I posed a few minutes ago. So everybody just sit tight, and we'll be back with more with Eddie Russell from Wild Turkey in just a minute.
Hey, Bourbon Lifers, we want to take just a second and tell you a little bit about 3 Chord Whiskey. 3 Chord's line of whiskeys embody the spirit of creativity. The whiskey is a true collaboration between producer and composer Neil Giraldo and master blender distiller Ari Sussman. The 3 Chord team of expert blenders, coopers, and sensory professionals have developed a multi-step process they call perfectly tuned taste. This process begins by carefully selecting the finest bourbon and rye whiskeys from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana, and then blending them all together. After each blend is completed, the 3 Chord team then applies their proprietary process of pyrolysis, that's a lot to say, isn't it? Which involves heating American oak to precise temperatures to release specific flavor and aroma compounds. Then they use another proprietary method called rhythmic disruption process, and that's more than just playing music to a bunch of barrels, which integrates all of those related compounds into the blended spirit. Finally, each small batch blend of 3 Chord is evaluated by a trained sensory panel to ensure an uncommon depth of flavor, character, aroma, and a perfectly tuned taste in each bottle. With their introductory blended bourbon, their Amplify Rye, Strange Collaboration, which is a Pinot Noir finished Kentucky bourbon, their 94 rated 12-bar reserve, and the brand new highly coveted 15-year Kentucky bourbon they call the Whiskey Drummer, there's a lot of options available from 3 Chord. Like the feeling you get when you hear that perfect song, you'll know that the 3 Chord line of whiskeys are right from the first sip. They resonate with so much flavor, you'll want an encore. Find out more about 3 Chord whiskeys and distribution in your area at www.3chordbourbon.com.
All right, everybody, welcome back for the third and final round of the Bourbon Life Podcast. I'm your host, Mark, and with me, as always, my good buddy, Matt, who stuck around for the final round. Matt, how you doing over there?
Mark, I'm doing excellent, man. I wouldn't miss this final round for anything because we have got a great guest. And I'll kick it back to you, Mark, and let you reintroduce and kick us right back into the question and see if that segues into what we've got poured up for round 3 here.
Matt, I can't remember the wonderful question that I asked, so I'll kick it back to you and let you do it. So,
really?
I'm like, so what did I ask?
We've got Eddie Russell joining us on the podcast for session 3, and we left off talking about the innovation that you brought into Wild Turkey.
Thank you.
And I think maybe that has something to do with what we've got poured up in our third session here. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I think, when we talked about bourbon not doing really good when I started, things that sort of changed it around and got things going again was the Jimmy Russells and the Bookers and the Elmer T. Lees going out in public and talking to people, taking their whiskey and going to different states and talking about the process and talking about the families. And, I know Elmer T. Lee was the first person to ever release a single barrel. Everybody in bourbon, they blend barrels together. And then you didn't say the word blend back in those days. Jimmy and Booker and them didn't like that because that's what the Scotch guys did. They blended whiskeys together.
Right.
They always said mingled, but when they went out on the road, and I've talked to my dad a lot about this, questions were very simple. But a lot of them were, how do you like your whiskey? One of the biggest ones, even when I started, was what's the difference in Scotch and Irish whiskey and American whiskey? And I had several different answers for them. The Irish started, the Scotch screwed it up, and the Americans perfected it. But, that's one of my favorite. But, I think that's what got it started. Elmer decided to come out with a single barrel because that's how if you ever have a chance to do a private barrel tasting at a distillery where you're tasting whiskey right out of a barrel, it's just the best possible form you can taste it. And then Booker came out with Booker's, and Jimmy came out with a product called Rare Breed. They were barrel proofs. Nobody had been doing that really. I mean, some in the beginning were, because it came out of the barrel at 100 and everybody did bottled and bond, but barrel proofs was a new thing. And, Jimmy came out with the Rare Breed, and it turned out to be his favorite. It was a 6 and 8 and 12-year-old combinations of whiskeys. And, people, when I started going out, they were like, well, why 6, 8, and 12-year-old? And so I go to Jimmy, and I got the same kind of answers I got my whole life. I said, Jimmy, why'd you use 6, 8, and 12-year-old? And he's like, because it tastes good. But, if you think about what we've talked about, if you've ever been around me, 6 is about as young as we like it. 8 is what Wild Turkey had forever. And 12 was as old as Jimmy liked it. And I think that combination, but, it came out, it was, several different proofs. And, people talk about barrel proofs, and barrel proofs, you have a little room to filter and stuff. So it's not like it's exactly out of the barrel. There is a little filtration, so you lose a little proof in it. But because no matter what anybody claims that they don't filter their whiskey, if you don't see charcoal floating in there, they're in some form, So really, people talk about my dad of never changing anything, never really innovating, never really doing anything. But he came out with Kentucky Spirit, which was a single barrel. He came out with Rare Breed. He did some stuff overseas in Japan, because, like I said, they had a bourbon boom in the 90s when it was still so good here in the United States. So I'll talk a little bit about the Rare Breed, and then I'll talk a little bit about more what I think my role's sort of been in the innovation end of it. But if you Rare Breed, and this one's always amazed me, Rare Breed to me was that bourbon that at the end of the day, I'm going to have one good drink, just pour it in a glass and just sip on it and enjoy it. It's not a bourbon that you want to drink 4 or 5 of, because it is a higher proof. When Jimmy started, our proofs would have been around 108 to 110 because we were barreling at 107. Now we barrel 115 and a half for a while. So my latest Rare Breed's 116.8. So it's a sipping bourbon. It's not the one that you're going to have 4 or 5 of each night, but just such great taste. But with a barrel proof bourbon, it's got to be bold, because you wanted to have that boldness of coming straight out of that barrel. So I think over the years, as I sort of took over picking the barrels out for it, it's changed a little bit, because the original Rare Breeds, I think, hit you really sort of strong at the front and then sort of mellowed out in the middle with those great flavors. And I'm like, again, you're talking about the vanillas and caramels, but I really pick up a little tobacco, a little dark chocolate, things like that. And that's because you're getting that older whiskey in there also with that 12-year. But it's always been so amazing to me as we did, we've all put in our time, at the whiskey shows and the whiskey fest and visiting different towns and doing tastings in liquor stores. And it never failed. If you were there for 2 hours, there would be 5 or 6 people come up and go, I can't drink that 101. It's too strong, but I love that Rare Breed. It's 10 or 12 proof points higher than the 101 even at that time, But I think that 12-year-old and the 8-year-old, I always tell people, when I started doing it, I had to talk to Jimmy and say, what are you looking for? Even though I sort of had an idea, because really you think about the big biting Rare Breed or the big boldness, that's for the 6-year-old. It's still young. It's still strong, That road is the really smooth part of it. And then that 12-year-old is going to give you a little hints of that woody smokiness, but also some of them deeper tastes, like I said, with that tobacco, with that dark chocolate. So it's just a good combination. But again, we say 6, 8, and 12. It's not always going to be that. There's times I might put 13 or 14 in there, to make it have the taste that you're looking for. But I think as I've been doing it, I've sort of moved that needle just a little bit. And I think it's okay because it's going to change every time we do a batch. There is no laws considered small batch, but for us, anything we call our small batch, we do 200 barrels or less, where 101 might be 1,500 barrels.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little more hand-selected barrels. And, so when I started doing it, I like a little smoother up front, and then that explosion of that rye and that Jimmy was looking for in the rare breed. So I think that's what did it. And I look back and, I thought, I'm never going to change 101. I'm never going to change rare breed too much or anything like that. But I just kept thinking, I can never be Jimmy Russell. I can, I learned everything from him. I take his products and sell them. But for me, it was more about, even Russell's was an innovation for us. It's a different taste than our regular one. It's a lot creamier and sweeter, not as long finish. But then I got to where, my son shows up and he loves rye, and we never really aged rye much over 6 or 7 years. And he's wanting to hold something back till it's 11 or 12 years old. And just listen to him talk about it and learning from him, which is pretty amazing to me. I learned from my father, and I'm now learning from my son with the rye whiskeys. But for me, it was about, I want to take where I just grew up with Booker. I mean, he was famous for saying, here's Jim Beam. And it was white label. Jim Beam, that's all they had. Jim Beam and black label. And he'd say, here's Jim Beam. If you don't like it, send it back. I'll drink it. He wanted to. He wanted to drink it all, And Jimmy was the same way with his 101. It was like, this is my product. Not everybody's going to like it. I don't care. But the people that know good bourbon, they're going to like it. That's just sort of how they felt. But for me, it was more, let me take my one recipe, because we have 600,000 or 700,000 barrels on different floors and warehouses, and they all taste different. So Russell's was sort of the start of that. And then I did a 6.5-year-old rye with Russell's brand. And Jimmy, at that time when Jimmy would say that won't work, it's no good, I worried to death. Now when Jimmy says it won't work and it's no good, it's going to be a hit, because he still has that idea. And so, starting the Master's Keep series, what I wanted to do was release stuff that nobody had ever really tasted. The first one was aged in brick warehouses, which we've never done and never will again.
Yeah.
It was completely different whiskey, and then doing a 12-year-old rye, doing a finish. Boy, you talking about Jimmy not liking me too much when I did a sherry finish, but I thought it turned out fantastic. And these are small batches, so it's not like you're doing them over and over. These are little one-time, limited-time offerings.
Yeah, right.
So, and then it helps me also sort of be relevant to what's going on today. I love Bernie Lovers from Heaven Hill. He sort of brought back Bottled and Bond on his own. He went out and started talking about it, got a tattoo, and it's sort of, people started trying to figure out what was Bottled and Bond, and so people started doing Bottled and Bond. So I took a very old whiskey. We'd never released anything over 12 or 13, 14 years old, and I did a 17-year-old twice.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that. And then even Long Branch, which was one of our latest products, completely different from any other wild turkey, and using mesquite wood and oak to sort of filter it through. Oh, not a good time with Jimmy. That's when you just sort of pass by him when you were at work, But for me, it's about trying to take my one recipe and putting out as many different flavor profiles, because if everybody liked the same bourbon, there'd only be one.
Yeah, right.
Same food, there'd only be one restaurant, cooking the same thing, but that's not the way things work. So doing things like that. And I focused a lot on the ryes, putting out some older ryes, and then actually came out with a rare breed rye, which totally amazed me when I got it put together, the different flavors that come through in that. I mean, I tasted lemon in it, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. And I'm like, Jimmy, try this. He I don't like rye whiskey. I said, Jimmy, try this. This is really good. I don't like rye whiskey.
Yeah, that rare breed rye. I've got a bottle not here with me, but I do have a bottle, and I remember because that just came out recently, right? I mean, it was a pretty recent release.
I wanted to do a barrel proof. I'm big on barrel proof. The things that people are asking for that they never did in the past, and
Right.
when we got to thinking about it, rare breed was our barrel proof bourbon, and we wanted to put it under that name, but they were scared to death because, rare breed has Jimmy Russell's name all over it,
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
They're asking me, like, should we put Jimmy's name on it? And I said, oh, yeah. You gotta punch back after all them years of him punching you. So
there you go.
He was down the visitor center one day right before he was getting ready to come out, and some visitor come in and said, I hear you're going to put out a rare breed rye. And Jimmy gave me that look. I'd have been scared to death, and I thought, yeah, I got you.
Well, I described that when I first bought a bottle. I tasted it, and I told people it was like kind of getting kicked in the teeth because it was it's bold and it's powerful, but it's an amazing rye. So I absolutely love that rare breed rye. So we'll do another episode at some point, and we'll taste that one.
Sounds good.
So Matt, getting back to the rare breed bourbon, what are you getting over there?
I get the oak is coming through on the nose. It's got a nice toasty oak nose. I pick up some leather on the nose as well. I think some of the maturity coming through from the leather is there, and it's got like a creamy, like an orange creamsicle. I'm picking up. There's a touch of orange coming through for me with it, and something sweet, which made just why I said the creamsicle, but like a honey and vanilla are there as well. So I kind of thought it smelled like an orange creamsicle. But
now, Matt, I'm pretty sure that Eddie didn't put any orange creamsicle.
Yeah.
Hey, I'll tell you, when I described Kentucky Spirit like that years ago, it always sort of had that orange peel taste to it. And I think you're right with the rare breed. I think that's that sort of 8-year-old number coming in there. That oaky smell and that sort of charry stuff is that 12-year-old. But I love listening to people describe it because when I first was around and watched Jimmy and Booker and them do it, they were like, this is what it tastes like. I'll give you generalities, but I'm not going to say this is what it tastes like because, just listen to Matt, how he describes things. He's got that palate that not everybody has. And then I listen to you. So I want people to,
sure,
say something every time. We had a quality control guy. Every time he tasted a drink of whiskey, he said, tastes like pears. After about the third or fourth time of some different whiskeys, I looked at him and said, thank you, sir. We don't need you to taste them.
Hey, Matt, there you go. There's an opening, Matt. So
yeah, that's right. Let me know where that job's posted. I'll apply in the morning.
Oh yeah, no doubt about that. So we talked a little bit about your barreling, because obviously it can go in the barrel at 125 proof and still be bourbon. Excuse me. You guys obviously barrel at a lower proof. So what drives that? What's the thought process behind doing that?
Well, originally, like I said, up until 63, 4 in there, you couldn't actually barrel at higher than 110.
Okay.
Seagram's Corporation lobbied the government to push it to 125, and they had all this data showing it didn't really affect it. But for us, we think when 125, you pull some of the more bitter stuff out of the wood that we don't like. We barreled at 107. My dad always said the best whiskey was barreled between 105 and 110. So we barreled at 107. My problem was rare breed. Before that, when we would dump a batch of whiskey, it was 103 or 4 or 5 proof. So we bottled at 101. Well, then
Right.
Jimmy comes out with Rare Breed, and the first batch was 109.6, 110. And I'm like, I'm having to steal all my high floor whiskey just to get it to that proof.
Mm-hmm.
And got to the point where all my older whiskey was below 100. I couldn't even get it to 101. So, I mean, I couldn't even do a 12-year-old in Japan anymore because I couldn't even get 101 proof. I actually had to change it to a 91 proof. And I raised the age to 13 years, so, you know, it would be a little older, but we just couldn't get the 101 proof. So I think it was about 2004, I went to 110 and did that for a few years and realized I still wasn't going to be able to keep up with that 101 proof, you know, because we do sell a 81 proof and we sold a 80 proof, but, you know, majority of our stuff is 101 proof or above.
Right.
So we barreled some at different proofs and we sampled them and we tasted them. And 3 or 4 years later, we decided 115. Hopefully, you know, after I'm gone and Jimmy's gone, they don't go higher. I mean, it is cheaper. Your barrel's your most expensive part of the process.
Right.
But we just feel like through all of our tasting and our research and our sampling that 125, you pull out some bitter aspects from that barrel that we're not looking for.
Yeah. Now you guys, you have warehouses. They're 7 floors. Is that right? Most of your warehouses.
Most all of them are 7. The newer ones they're building now are 6. I have a couple that are 8. They changed much from originally, but now they sort of have a standard. Most of them are 6.
Gotcha.
But there's so much difference from that first floor and that 7th floor as far as heat and humidity and change. And then you got those middle floors where everything's sort of perfect. And of course, everybody's like, why don't you just heat and cool it so it'll all be the same? And I'm like, well, I don't want it all to be the same. You know, people talk about rotation. You know, really, there's only one brand that rotates anymore, and that's because they really only have one product.
Right, yeah.
When I started, really, 101 was the only product we had, so we rotated. But now with Russell's and Long Branch and Rare Breed and all those different products, I need that variety. So we hardly rotate anything. Maybe some older whiskey down to some lower floors to slow it down. You know, a few barrels here and there, but in the old days, that was summer. When you shut down the distillery, everybody rotated barrels. You know, they moved stuff from the 1st and 2nd to the 7th and 6th, and the 7th and 6th down the 1st and 2nd. You didn't have to worry about where you pulled it from for your 101.
So when you guys are putting barrels up, are you now just saying, okay, we want these barrels to go in the middle because we think these are going to go for this brand? Or is it just still
you just don't know enough at that point. You know, I want to be very consistent with my new distillate, or what I call white dog. I want it to all be sort of the same when it goes in the barrel, but it could be barrels sitting side by side for 8 years, and one of them will be amazing and one of them just be average. You know, so all we do is we pull from different floors for every batch we dump.
Gotcha.
You know, they'll work in a warehouse for maybe half a week or something, and then the guys are coming in the second half putting new distillate in those same spots. You know, so you're not really. It's in that 4th, 5th, 6th years when you decide, hey, I need to move this to the top or bottom, or it's perfect. But most of my single barrels, my very small batches are coming from those middle floors because you just can't beat what actually happens there.
Yeah, kind of a sweet spot, I guess, like the honey hole.
Yeah, you learn that pretty quick when you start working there because your employees are drinking out of the middle of the warehouse.
It's like if Matt ever comes to visit, don't give him a drill and turn him loose. I'm just gonna.
That's right.
I've seen him in the action when he has a drill in a warehouse. So
I'm just gonna follow the employees in there and see where they're
at.
at.
That's what I did on my second week there. They kept upstairs. And every afternoon about 3, and on the second Friday I was there, I'm like, where are y'all going? Because they weren't inviting me, because at that time Jimmy was plant manager, master distiller, human resources, and everything. Even though I knew them my whole life, they were a little bit shy about me seeing what they were doing. And finally this old leader says, come with me, boy. And he took me up 4th floor. And I tell people to this day, it might be the best taste of whiskey I've ever had in my life, because I never had it like that. He pulled it right out of the barrel.
Yeah.
A little plastic cup, 21 years old on a Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. I felt it go through every vein in my body. I was like Dorothy. I was kicking my heels going, I'm home, you know.
Yeah. You knew where you wanted to be and where you wanted to stay at that point.
That's right.
So now you're working with your son as well, right? Bruce, is that correct?
Yeah, he's more on the marketing end of it. I mean, he's
okay.
a brand ambassador. You know, I don't know that he'll ever do like me and Jimmy did. I don't think he will.
Okay.
Okay, he knows as much about distilling as a lot of people, but he enjoys that ambassador part of it. You know, anytime I'm dealing with rye, and, you know, when I'm doing these projects, I'll ask him to come in and taste. I really like his opinion, you know, on different things, because, you know, Jimmy is still that older gentleman that thinks the way it was 20 years ago.
Right.
I see the change, but I'm not 30 years old like my son is. He's right in the mix of that. So it's wonderful to have those two opinions in each of my ears, so I can sort of understand. I mean, he's out there in public. He talks to all the bartenders, you know, right. Having that coming in one ear and having Jimmy over in the other ear going, don't change nothing, don't change it. It sort of works, you know.
Oh man, yeah, that sounds like kind of a tough spot maybe to be in, but yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying. So you mentioned the Kentucky Spirit a few minutes ago, so I'm just going to tell you, I loved the old bottle. So can I ask about the bottle change? Can you talk about that or not?
Yeah, you know, so that bottle was just an iconic bottle with that sort of turkey fan on it. I loved it myself, but actually from London, and we had a lot of problems with the glass. I actually had to cancel 11 private barrels that had been picked. This was probably 7-8 years ago.
Yeah.
We just had so much problem with it. It was so expensive.
Sure.
You know, and of course, marketing likes to change things all the time. Got a little hard knocks over changing that bottle, but it wasn't something we really thought about at that time. It was just, we had so much problem getting the glass, and the glass was good. And, you know, those things happen. As Jim says, the juice inside, it doesn't matter what the bottle looks like. I don't necessarily agree 100% anymore, but what's inside should be the main focus.
Yeah, well, I'm happy I still have like half of a bottle, and you know, I break it out on special occasions, and it's just for me.
There you go. Perfect.
I'm gonna save that. So we're really at the end of round 3. So we'll wrap it up here kind of quickly, but I wanted to know what's the first bourbon. I'm just curious. What's the first bourbon that you remember ever having?
Well, I halfway remember, and it would have been Wild Turkey or JTS Brown, because, you know, as a young kid, I'm the youngest of 3. I had older sisters, a little bit older than me, and my brother. And, you know, my brother wasn't as much as me, but I was sort of a daddy's boy. I went out to Stereo with him on the weekends when I was young, and because he went every day. And, you know, he'd have that bourbon in his hand, you'd smell it, and I'd think, man, that smells good. Finally, he said, I pestered him so much, he let me and my brother both taste it. And it sort of worked the same way with my 2 boys. Bruce is my son that's working for me. He loved it. My other son doesn't drink. Same way as me and my brother. I loved it. He doesn't drink at all. But, you know, I can remember as a younger man drinking different bourbons that people had out, because I never was a beer drinker. I didn't like white spirits. So I was a bourbon guy. So, I had back then a half pint or a pint in my back pocket while everybody else was drinking beer. I was drinking bourbon, just had to make sure I didn't drink as much as they were.
Yeah, that's the kicker right there. When you have the bottle, you got to make sure you don't match them drink for drink, right?
That's right. That's right.
So let me ask you real quick, what's the future kind of look like for you and for Wild Turkey? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, for us at Wild Turkey, we're making a lot of whiskey right now. We feel like things are going to keep going the way they're going. It's always been sort of up and down industry as people get new products, and different things. But it's the difference in our consumer. That young consumer is drinking bourbon at an early age, so they're always going to drink bourbon.
Yeah.
People are more proud of American products than they used to be, so that helps. So we look for good things down the road. I mean, Wild Turkey grew more last year than it had grown since the 40s, I think.
Wow.
So that, this COVID thing was an awful thing. And a lot of people went to things they knew and could trust. And Wild Turkey was one of those bourbons. So it was really great. But we think things are going to go on. For me, I'm going to keep looking for ways to put out products, whether they be limited time offerings or, it's hard to bring out new permanent things. Long Branch, I had to go to extreme lengths of 2 different kinds of wood to make it taste different. So, but right now I'm focused a little bit on the ryes with the rare breed rye, and
right.
It has some of that Matt was talking about setting hiding somewhere that I may want to put out on the road. So I'm also, I've got a little older whiskey that I've been using in some stuff. I'm releasing a 13-year-old barrel proof non-chill filter Russell's product.
Right. Just saw that. Yeah. Nice.
So even though Jimmy says it's not good after 12, I think I can get out some really good whiskeys, that are a little older. So eventually you run out of those, though. I mean, you think about it, I put out a 17-year-old, and I think I've been working for the company for 34 years. So that was I've been fooling with for half of my career. It's not like, you make a meal and they're going to eat it right now.
That's right.
17 years before they got to taste it. So it's a little bit different product as far as that. But I do like putting out things, when you look at what's happening today, people are looking for the more unique, older whiskeys. I love the non-chill filter. I love that barrel proof look at it. So, you'll see things like that come out. There'll be some more Master's Keeps on the road. And, sooner or later, I'll be looking at Bruce going, what are you thinking about doing? But right now, that's not going on. So,
yeah, well, that's great to hear. So, so our listeners can find you guys. You're on social media. Obviously, you're on Instagram and Facebook, and you got your website and your products. I mean, people can find Wild Turkey pretty much everywhere. Is that pretty accurate?
That's 100% correct. I mean, for a while, we didn't have the 101 rye very much out there, but I'm sort of caught up now. If your liquor store isn't carrying 101 rye, tell them to ask for it because it's there. But otherwise, any bar you go in is going to have a 101 bourbon in it for sure, whether it has anything else or not. Any liquor store, so you can find our products. It shouldn't be a problem whatsoever.
Great. Matt, final thoughts on the rare breed, man, before we wrap it up.
It's a huge hit. It's got a great big palette of, I pick up leather, oak, tobacco, a little bit of honey on the front as well. And it leads to that nice spiciness, and the age really shines through on this one as well. The nice rounded out finish with it. The peppercorn shines through, but it's not overpowering. It's well balanced again, but it brings a whole lot more flavor than what we had, and a whole lot more character than the 101. I think it's a huge hit.
Yeah, I agree with that, Matt. This is I already had one bottle and drank it all. So this is the second bottle. So, I'm working on that one. So, but yeah, I definitely enjoy it. And the 116.8, that proof point, that's getting up there where my range. I love those higher proof bourbons. So this is a really, really great drink, and definitely enjoy it, Eddie. So, and thank you very much for being with us tonight. So before we wrap it up, is there anything else you want to add? Anything to close it out?
Not really. I mean, anybody that's ever been around me or my father realized that, to talk to you, please come and visit us at Wild Turkey. We're still a little bit handicapped with the COVID, but the way things are looking, things are going to ease up a lot. So if you come and do a tour with us, we take you through all the working spots, and usually Jimmy's sitting in that visitor center to talk to you. So it's a pretty good deal. So I look forward to getting back out on the road and talking to people, but right now this is how we're doing it, and I'm happy to do it, and I appreciate the opportunity you have me on there.
Well, like I said, we've been working on this for about a year, so I'm thrilled that we were finally able to make this happen, Eddie, and thanks again for joining us. Matt, before we wrap it up, anything else you want to add?
Eddie, thanks for taking the time to sit down with us and our listeners and going through your history, the history of Wild Turkey, and everything that you all have brought in the past and you're bringing now and will be bringing to us in the future. So we really appreciate your time, and thank you so much. It's been really interesting and really a treat to chat with you. Thanks.
Cheers, everybody.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Cheers to that. And I got to take a drink on the cheers. Okay, so now that I've done that, I have to thank our sponsors again. The Stave Restaurant out there on McCracken Pike. Go visit those guys. They're doing some great stuff, and the food is just amazing. Check them out online, thestavekentucky.com. Also on Instagram and Facebook. But we really appreciate their sponsorship. And then also 3-Chord Bourbon, then Master Distiller Ari Sussman, just doing some really good stuff up there. So we appreciate their sponsorship and what they're putting out. So with that said, I'm going to wrap us up and send us home with our tagline, which is, may your glasses always be full, and may you keep on living the bourbon life.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Bourbon Life Podcast. Our mission at the Bourbon Life is simple: to share our passion for all things bourbon with you every week. And we'd really love to hear your thoughts on how we're doing. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at The Bourbon Life. You can also contact us by email at thebourbonlife@gmail.com. And you can always find us on your favorite podcast platform. If you have a moment, we'd love it if you would rate us and give us a review. So until next week, we hope your glass is always full and that you keep on living the bourbon life.